Daniela Pardo. I'm a reporter for Spectrum News in LA, but I'm based here. I'm the Sacramento correspondent and reporter for LA. And my first She Shares event was actually 4 years ago. I was a new political reporter, and I was Googling events to network and meet other women like the ones in the room. And I came across a She Shares event. And I said, I'm going to go check it out. I don't know anybody, but that's the point, to go meet people. And I'm so glad I did, because I was really nervous to start my new job. And after meeting so many women who I later interviewed or became a source, I felt really empowered, and I felt the support. Even though I'm not a politician, I felt that partnership, that relationship is super important. And it all started in an event like this. And so it's a full circle moment to be here tonight and be a part of what's going to be an amazing event. And I hope everybody feels really happy that they came and feels full, because it's going to be a really great evening with really meaningful conversations. And I also want to give a shout out to those that are in the mentorship program. So if that's you, can you please stand up? Amazing. Yes. Thank you. And now I have the privilege of introducing someone that really needs no introduction, because you all know her. She is an award-winning filmmaker, a mom of four, the co-founder of the California Partners Project, the founder of the Misrepresentation Organization. Did I get that right? Representation Project Organization. She is our governor's wife. She is the first partner, Jennifer Siebel-Newsom. Please help me welcome her.
What a great turnout. Thanks everyone for coming.
How are you doing?
How am I?
Yeah.
Oh, how are you?
Good.
Deflect.
Good.
Busy. Life
yes.
is very full.
We thank you so much for making the time. You have such a busy schedule with all the things that you do, but I know everyone here is really looking forward to hear about so much of the great work that you do. And last night, when I was getting ready for this interview, I was reading an interview that you did recently where you said, I just love being in a room full of women. Rooms like this one.
Yes.
And so why is that? What is it about spaces like this that make you feel the way that you do?
I love the sisterhood. I love the energy. I love our allies, all of you great men in the room. I love when you feel comfortable in our rooms and you advocate for us and stand up for us. But I'm one of 5 girls, and so the feminine was very present in my household, and I just feel like such a connection and sisterhood. And that if we all recognize our power and use our voices and recognize, that we're in this together, there's no leak on my side of our boat. It's our boat. So we have to, support each other. If we get that in my lifetime, that we will transform the world. Like every problem that we have in society right now will be fixed when women come together and partner with our male allies and other allies, but when more women are in the rooms making decisions, changing the status quo, and transforming not just our culture, but our society and our economy.
Absolutely. Cheers to that. I've had the privilege of interviewing you a lot, but I'm excited to do a more informal conversation, get to know you better. So it's Women's History Month, as we all know. Who are some of the women in your life that inspire you, empower you, and motivate you to do the work that you do?
Thank you. So Grandma Jean is my mom's mom, who passed at 94. She was a military spouse. My grandfather was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and they lived in Montana, they lived in Michigan, they lived in Virginia, they lived in the UK, and she raised pretty much and birthed pretty much all 4 of her children without him being present. And so she really inspired me that I could be of service, because she was always volunteering in the military, but also later in life. I think she was 90 maybe when she retired from volunteering at the Church Mouse, which is like the equivalent of the Salvation Army. So she always just inspired in me that piece of service, that service orientation and that motherhood orientation, and that you can do it even if your husband's not around orientation. And she was so kind. And she was a huge 49ers fan.
Go Niners.
Huge 49ers fan. But she was such a kind woman. So Grandma Jean. And then literally, I see some mentors in the room. I'm looking at you two over there. And it's all of the women that I touch me, that are in my life. Susie Buell is always inspiring me with her love and her lightness and her just incredible passion for women and climate and gender equity. Regina Scully is a sister to me. They're all like big sisters that have taught me to take care of myself, even though I don't. I'm learning. I'm still learning and working on that. But that have fed me and nurtured my soul in some way. I was just on the phone with my producer right now. We're making Miss Representation 2.0, Miss Representation the Revolution. And my producer, Camille, she's French, and she's maybe a little older than me. I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm older than everyone. But again, like a big sister in some ways and a real partner. So it's really all the women that I partnered with, Eileen Getty, that have just taught me about life from their perspective and guided me, and also been there to support and nurture where maybe I'm lacking in self-nurture. So it's honestly, I pull from everyone, I learn from everyone, and it's all energy too, right? So it's colleagues, it's women younger than me. It's one of my best friends is 10 years younger than me, and she's just so fabulous. And every time I talk to her, I feel like everything's gonna be okay. So that's really the sisterhood and that partnership piece. And it's taken a while. I feel like I've cultivated friends throughout my life, and some of my best friends are from childhood. One actually, I don't know why I'm saying this right now, but just she took her own life. Yesterday was the anniversary of her death, which is super tragic.
So sorry.
But you know, she lives in me still, as does my older sister. But it's all these just angels in everyone that I feel so grateful that I can walk on this journey. But it's a journey, right? Because you befriend people and you go, I don't feel good after I'm with you. So then you maybe pay less attention to that relationship. But it's really, I think, when women feel good in their own skin, they're able to be their full selves, and then the sisterhood is really magical and possible.
Absolutely. It's so important to have that strong support system behind you, and it sounds like you have a great one. Now, we're going to get a little bit more into all the work that you've done as first partner, but what a lot of people don't realize is that even before you were first partner, you have been a champion for pay equity, closing the gender pay gap for women, for families, for moms. But in the last few years, you've gotten to do it as first partner. And so what are some of the initiatives that you've seen that your office has helped lead that are making a difference in the lives of women throughout our state?
Great. Thank you for asking. So, California for All Women and California for All Children, we launched early on. California for All Women really led with our first initiative, the California Equal Pay Pledge. Just recently, and we got to spend some time with you on that day, we announced that over 200 major companies, some actually small women-owned businesses or nonprofits, but some major global companies headquartered in California, over 200 plus municipalities have signed on to the Equal Pay Pledge. So it's really exciting because they're basically committing to conduct an annual pay gap analysis, basically review their hiring and promotion practices to reduce or eliminate unconscious bias, and then invest in transparency and other equal pay best practices. So that's been really exciting, and that's part of our California for All Women's campaign. Separately, Women on Public Company Boards has been a huge initiative, starting with the passage of SB 826 that we then started measuring, and then we came out with these playbooks. So just the other day, we announced our Equal Pay Playbook, but with Women on Boards, we have a board diversity playbook and a board culture playbook, and I can get into the details on those, but largely they're to kind of take excuses off the table and give people and companies best practices to take to basically establish parity and a healthier culture for women, in particular marginalized women or women that haven't historically had seats at those tables of power. So those are both very exciting. We're coming out with more work on sex trafficking, a lot of like internal government work, similarly on violence against women, which I'm excited to move the needle on in this state, and survivors as well. And then, obviously the administration's worked very hard on protecting women's reproductive health and rights, and we've been championing family-friendly practices beyond pay equity, but to include paid family leave, sick leave, et cetera, et cetera. But I also think about, just to connect the dots, I'm super proud as well of our California for All Children's campaign, because in that work, we are trying to make life easier for working moms and families. So part of the passage of universal meals and the Farm to School initiative is ensuring that California public school children receive those free, delicious, nutritious, locally sourced meals a day at school. In addition to our major investments, $4.7 billion in children's mental health, we're trying to meet families where they're at and make all of the best-in-class resources and tools, from mindfulness to breath work to movement, available to families so that we can stop cycles of stress, anxiety, and despair, and really move Californians in a healthier direction, and then give them access to resources through our different hubs and websites to, again, the best-in-class mental health care and services. So all of that, for me, is like a family-friendly agenda, and making sure that we are centering women, centering women's needs, and making it easier for California women to thrive.
Wow, you're impressive, and the work that
partnership,
you do is
right?
Absolutely. Last week was Equal Pay Day, and unfortunately, we still have a pay gap, and for women of color, that gap is even greater. And this is so personal to me because not at this job, but at a previous job, I remember when I found out how I got paid significantly less than my male colleagues and my other counterparts that weren't people of color, and I just remember I maybe saw the statistics but didn't think much of it. I'm like, oh, no, that doesn't really happen in my field. And when I realized, nope, it does, and it hurts, and it crushed me. And I remember thinking, man, I wish I would have known more about what to ask for when I got this job. Pay transparency laws that we have now, I wish were around back then for me to be able to advocate for more money and then it was just something that really marked me, and I've been now, because I know what it feels like to get paid way less for the same amount of work, and this is people that had the same experience or less, so I'm like, it just didn't make sense. I'm a huge advocate for being transparent about these kind of things, and so I'm sure you've heard a lot of stories like these from women throughout our state. How does hearing that make you keep fighting the good fight? Because it's hard. I know a lot of people don't think we have these problems.
I know. And I'm so sorry that you experienced that. And it's not right. It's not just. And we have to put an end to it. We live in this capitalist society where wealth begets wealth. If you don't have resources, you can't buy that car, you can't rent that home, you can't pay for childcare. You have to make, decisions that ultimately are, I would argue, harmful to your mental health, your family's mental health, when you're having to work, multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and having to leave your children at home or find some caregiver that's maybe not even a proper caregiver to take care of the kids, or whatever it is. Like, you don't even have to have children. It's just not right. So I completely, it enrages me. California women are still losing around $87 billion a year to the pay gap. It makes no sense, right? And so it's one of the reasons I am so committed to this, given our society. Frankly, I made a documentary called The Great American Lie back, it came out, I think, like during the pandemic or just around the pandemic. And so not great timing for the world to see it because we were, distracted and distribution sucked at the time. But what in that film, though, we look at how, we've become this society where in 96, the gaps between the haves and have-nots have gotten wider, and the zip code that you're born into is a determinant of, sadly, your destiny. It's not the same advantage, or younger kids that are born have less advantage than their parents, unless their parents obviously have a tremendous amount of wealth and are passing that wealth down. So not everyone's born inside the ballpark. And in fact, we've uncovered, and we know this, many people are born far outside of the ballpark. So equal pay is necessary to give people opportunity to, again, not just achieve the California dream, but to achieve the American dream. So I'm 100% committed. We know that if we close the pay gap in the United States, we'd add an additional $400 billion to the U.S. economy. I think we'd add even an additional $11 trillion to the world economy. So it's just a no-brainer. Again, recognizing that women also are not just when we accrue wealth and income, we're not just caring for children, feeding them, putting a shelter over their head, clothing them, as I learned in my days working in the micro enterprise world, like the Grameen Bank world. But we also realize that women are the majority of consumers, both business and individual consumption. And so just the concept that they have to ask somebody for money to buy something for their family, like it's just not, it doesn't make any sense to me. And the fact that we aren't going to pay them, again, the mental health impact on not just them, but their children when mom's struggling, like it doesn't bode for a happy future for anyone. So again, it's just something that I'm super committed to. It's why we launched the Equal Pay Pledge. It's why we've come out with this Equal Pay Playbook. And really, California still does have some of the strongest equal pay laws in the nation, but we still have that gap, right? And it is possible to close that gap. I mean, it is about shifting hearts and minds. It is about leadership, but like 5 of the, steps that corporations need to, or 6 of the steps that corporations need to take is, 1 is you need buy-in from the top. 2, you need what is it called? It's a philosophy. It's like it's a compensation philosophy. Thank you. I was saying consumer knows. It's a compensation philosophy. You need a communications plan. You need to standardize job descriptions and pay. One needs to conduct this annual pay gap analysis, and then one needs to, ensure that this is not just something you do this year, but it's like institutionalized in the company's best practices, so it's over the long haul. And that's really what we're trying to do in California. It's one of the reasons California signed the Equal Pay Pledge. It's another reason why we have a chief equity officer per the governor's direction in government for the first time ever. It's because now is the time to close the pay gap for all of us.
And I know that one of the ways that I've learned from interviewing you and learning more about your work that you can do that is getting more women on boards. And that's something that in the last few years we've seen way more women than 5-6 years ago. You know the numbers better than me, but can you talk about the importance of having, I mean, it's a no-brainer, but if you can just expand on the importance of having not just more women, but women of color, LGBTQ plus women, making sure that all women are represented at these decision-making tables.
Yeah. So we know that the more diversity you have around a table, the greater the creativity, the productivity, and the better the bottom line. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to come to a decision, but you know that there are so many different perspectives and experiences and talents that are brought into that decision-making process. So that's part of the win-win, right? Number 2, women have historically, from studies, shown to have better ESG outcomes, so environment, social, and governance. That's, I would argue, essential when we're living in a time with crazy climate high and lows, and just extremes that are impacting, agriculture, our cities, our roads, our bridges, et cetera, but the health and well-being of all of us. So the other thing, I guess for me is just, and I this is not something we've addressed yet. I've tried to address it, but it isn't. It's something that I want to work towards. Is just this acknowledgement. It's not all women, but many women come with a service orientation. I think we've been socialized to be of service, to be other-oriented, whereas there's a lot of pressure on young men to be just about themselves and to make money, and that's sort of their goal in life, is to become successful so that then they can maybe do something with it. And part of that service orientation is women that run nonprofits or women that are in government. They already have that. And that's one of the things I'd like to see, more women from government and women that have run nonprofits or sat on nonprofit boards. I'd like to see more of them in public company board seats or private company board seats. And we have a major need for more Latina women and more Black women on public company boards. So we're thinking about how we could be more strategic to ensure that their perspectives and lived experiences are at those tables of power where major decisions are made that that are impacting, our health, our physical health, our mental health. I'll give you one example. Look at Silicon Valley. Had more women been early on in those companies or at the tables of power making decisions, I don't think we would have so much or have allowed for so much sort of bigotry, racism, misogyny, and hate online. I don't think that we would have the anonymity of it. I think that there would have been ooh, that's unkind. That's not okay. You can't make money off of that, about dividing people, misinforming people, belittling people, bullying people. Again, think about who's the victims online more often than not. It's women, LGBTQ+, marginalized communities, women of color. It is, and half the time you don't know if they're bots or others. So again, I bring that up just as an example because I think that's something we still have to address in our culture. We must, and that requires, I think, more men of conscience, but more women and more diverse women around the table saying, those algorithms, they might actually divide us. They might actually put us into two camps. They might actually perpetuate tribalism, right? I think that is the downside of not having our perspectives, because we're also thinking, that device might, or that game, or that technology might addict my kid. And half the time, the guys aren't caregiving, so they don't know about the addiction that's happening when you try to pull your son off that device or off that game. So again, I just think our lived experiences and perspectives are so important, and it's why we need to have seats at the tables of power.
It definitely matters who's there. And I remember you saying last week, I so desperately want to be there already. And it makes sense now why you don't stop. You're all over the place at events, speaking to so many people throughout California. If you don't mind, I want to have you share a message for maybe the younger women in our room. And I want to give a shout out to some of the girls from St. Francis High School. They're here in the room. They're probably our younger guests. And full transparency, my husband works there. He couldn't be here, but he sent the president and a lot of the students.
That's
which is
wonderful.
So
my goodness.
So do you mind just sharing a message to the younger women and leaders in our room, please?
Yes. Okay. Use your voice. God gave it to you, or whatever you believe. You were given a voice. Stand in your power. Know that your perspective matters. It will make for a better outcome decision. Trust in yourself. Find sisters and allies, other allies. Ask for help. But really create your village, because you're going to need a village. And the village because none of us get anywhere on our own. We all achieve what we achieve through partnership. Like, I have all these partners in here who have helped me be where I am today. And yes, it doesn't take away from my grit. It doesn't take away from my work ethic. It doesn't take away from my intelligence, but it's all of us collectively that are helping the first partner, using the first partner's office, or be successful, or our films be successful, right? It's really about partnership and sisterhood. And stand up to hate. Stand up to othering. And don't spend too much time focused on this or this. It's a waste, I think, personally. Just enough that you feel good in your skin, and then move on and be engaged civically, and do not be afraid to lead, because we need your leadership now more than ever.
Amen to that. All right, last question, unfortunately, but you have a few years left as first partner, and I know we're still going to be hearing about what you do in the years to come, but when people remember you and look at what you did as first partner, what do you hope to most be remembered for in this role?
Thank you. I hope that we've moved the needle on gender equity in California in closing the pay gap and the wealth gap enough that there's less of an opportunity gap, and that more of us are investing or invested in, and that we feel this financial security, whether we have a partner or not, and that we want to raise our children in this state because of California's extraordinary, and they're going to get better and better, community schools, and our farm to school programming, and all of our mental health support, and our before and after school and summer school. Like, I want this to be the state where you want to work, raise your family, retire, maybe care for elders, but where you want to spend your life. And so I'd love to be affiliated with that. And then also, like, I'd love California to be affiliated with saving the planet because we were braver and bolder and more committed to addressing climate change, and and that we can model that for the rest of the world. But yeah, no, I'm so grateful for this time period. It's flown by, it's flying by. I hope that we can just continue to institutionalize our values and partner with all of you beyond this. Because I always said to my husband, I was like, this is great and all, but like, I was doing this before, just, in a different way, and I'll keep doing it after. You do whatever political thing you need to do, but I'm busy. I got stuff to do.
Hello.
So anyway, thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much. We're going to do a photo, and then the conversation about pay equity isn't over. We're going to have a panel, but we're going to do a photo with them, and then they'll move on.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Have a good evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Arielle, Julie, and I'm going to moderate the second half of this conversation that the first partner started. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and appear on stage with these leaders and these thought leaders in this space. So we have 45 minutes, I think, for the conversation. And unfortunately, we don't have time for audience Q&A, but if you hear anything that resonates with you, I do encourage you to talk to the panelists individually after the panel. So I thought this might have set off my microphone, but I'll pull it back up. So I'm going to get started with introductions. So I'm Arielle, and I am a She Shares mentor. I have been since 2020 and a board member for almost 3 years. I think most people in this room, if you know me for leading salary negotiation workshops for the She Shares cohorts. I also work in the tech space in recruiting, and I have been very closely tied to the equal pay movement from the side of working internally at giant tech companies for a while. So I'm really excited. I'm going to get started introducing everyone. First, one sec. First, we have Maria sitting next to me. Maria is the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce. One second, sorry, I'm struggling with my tablet. In August of 2018, she became the first woman and Latina to lead the Chamber of Commerce. Her background as an accomplished businesswoman, entrepreneur, and community leader makes her a steward of the Chamber's new vision and direction. Next to Maria is Jessica Ramey. Jessica is a policy director. I don't have all my notes, sorry. One second. I'm really not able to see this. Okay, is a policy director and deputy legal director at Equal Rights Advocates, where she leads state and federal policy advocacy with a focus on pay equity, harassment, discrimination, and other civil rights. She also represents workers in employment discrimination cases. Next to Jessica, we have Tiffany. Tiffany Whiten is a senior government relations advocate for the California State Council of Service Employees, SEIU, California, who focuses on racial and social justice issues as they relate to the public sector. In this role, she represents over 700,000 working people in California, the majority of those people being women and from underrepresented groups. Next to Tiffany, we have Kevin. Kevin Kish is a civil rights attorney who works as director of the California Civil Rights Department, previously known as the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And his department recently reached a notable settlement with Activision Blizzard video game company regarding alleged gender discrimination, pay inequities, and sexual harassment. So the first question I want to throw out to everyone, or whoever wants to answer, is what do you wish more people knew or understood about the movement for equal pay and gender equality? Gender equity.
I'll jump in. I'll start. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's so great to be here with such an esteemed group. I think one thing that is important about that question is, you know, when you're in the workforce, you want to thrive. You want to know that everyone is rooting for you. And when you don't have that type of equality, I think it's like that story that Daniela told about herself finding out, you know, about that gap and how crushing and demoralizing that is. So I would want people to know that the fact that it is, if it's not being addressed, if it's an issue in an organization, it is demoralizing for women. And I could tell a similar story like her, and just the feeling of being crushed by that revelation of understanding that there's such a gap. And if we all believe that we want to thrive and we want women to thrive in an organization, it's important to know what happens when you don't have that.
Agree. I think in terms of the kind of broader pay equity movement, something that I think is gaining more attention is that there are definitely issues of pay discrimination where women, like the example we heard in the previous panel, women are being paid less than their male counterparts for doing the same, or here in California, substantially similar work, and that is still far too common. We represent women who have experienced this issue, but there are so many other contributors to the overall gender and racial wage gap that women experience, especially women of color. And I think there's growing awareness, but there are these other contributors. Occupational segregation is often it's estimated accounts for about 50% of the wage gap, which reflects the fact that women, particularly women of color, are concentrated in minimum wage and low wage industries overall, but then even within companies, often you'll see patterns of women, particularly women of color, concentrated in lower paying jobs and underrepresented at the top. Pay secrecy. So a lot of times you hear stories, we hear from women all the time who had no idea for years and years that they were being paid less than their male counterparts until there's some slip up. They find a file open or someone mentions something out of, that they overheard. And those types of kind of pay secrecy trends where people don't feel comfortable talking about pay, that can contribute as well. Some types of employer practices, like relying upon and asking about prior pay. When we have a wage gap in virtually every industry and occupation in the country, when employers rely on prior salary, that just perpetuates past pay discrimination and really kind of allows it to follow women from job to job. And then, of course, kind of a lack of access to paid family leave for a lot of women and childcare for families, but that often the burden is usually borne by women who have to take time out of the workforce to care for children or sick family members when they don't have adequate access to those supports. So I think that's just one issue that we're trying to make sure people understand. There's a lot of contributors to that wage gap, and it requires a really multifaceted approach to trying to close it.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback off of that. I think equal pay, it's equal pay, but it's so much more than that. It's many different movements. It's the labor movement. It's the women's rights movement. It's disability rights movement. It's civil rights movement. It's so many things that encompasses, and when you have that collective power, you can really work towards your goal of really addressing equal pay. From my perspective, and you're coming from the labor movement, it's more than just equal pay. It's about equal power. It's about making sure that you're sharing in that equal power. It's not all about the dollars and the cents. It's having a voice. That paycheck, it can come, it can go, but power persists. It's long lasting. I think it's important to note that women that are in a union, they have a pay bump that is 23% more than a woman that's a non-union member. And I think that's very important to know. Again, this labor movement is part of the equal pay movement, and we just have to remember that. And it's all about this collective power and ensuring that we are sharing in the collective power. Having collective power so that we can end equitable hiring, so that we can address equitable hiring, so that we can end the devaluation of certain careers and professions like caregiving that are predominantly done by women or women of color, putting an end to it and making sure that we also create through collective power that we create social infrastructures like childcare and long-term services and support, so that we're not only supporting the family, but we're doing our due diligence and we're supporting that working mom as well.
I would like to address the elephant on the stage, which is that this is called She Shares. And when Tamara reached out to me, I was, are you sure? I am a he, him. But I think that's how I can best answer this question, which is that pay equity is good for men. And it's really important to hear men talk about that too. Racial equity is good for white people. Disability rights is good for people who are not yet disabled, right? Why? Because how are you going to flourish in a just society if people around you are living in conditions of lack of freedom, of structural inequity? It just doesn't work. But we have to get men to talk about it too. Women have actually done, in my view, their fair share of the lifting on this issue, right? You guys are all here. We're never going to convince everyone. We haven't convinced everyone that anti-discrimination law is a great idea, right? Like there is pushback against that. You're not going to convince everybody on equal pay, but we can convince more people if more men start talking about it. Why? Because social science tells us that men actually think other men are more sexist than they are. Right? When they're in a room not like this one, when they're in a room the opposite of this one, they don't speak up. And then nobody speaks up. And then maybe somebody does say something sexist, and then nobody ever speaks up again. So to have our brothers, our sons, you can try for your fathers. Mine is probably not going to be a leader on this issue. Maybe some fathers, but husbands and allies, I think we can get there. It is good for men in the same way that it is good for women.
And Kevin, can you keep talking about the importance of collecting pay and demographic data?
Yeah, so this is a question directed at me because the department that I lead, the California Civil Rights Department, has an annual obligation given to us by the legislature to collect pay and demographic data of California employees in large workplaces, so workplaces of 100 or more employees. This is relatively new. We're in our 4th year of data collection. We've released 2 years of data collection. The data tells you what you already know, right? Most of the highest paying positions are occupied by white men. It's kind of shocking in California, but that's who's there. And one of the things that I think is really important about the law is the very act of being forced to collect the data over time tends to have had in other jurisdictions an effect of reducing the pay gap. So just being forced to look at the problem, this makes sense, right? If you don't ever look at a problem, you're not going to be able to solve it. One note of caution for those of you in the room who are in the position of influencing how this is done at large employers, if you assign it to your lowest ranking HR worker, then it's probably not going to result in change, right? You have to have somebody who has a position of power look at this. So we can look at that, and just by collecting it, the employers should, over time, start to move towards more equity. We can also look at it and say where women are missing. To your point about occupational segregation or just missing in an entire workplace. Even if we're looking at an agricultural workplace, we might expect to see only 10% women, but if we see 4,000 employees and only 100 of them are women, where are the other 300? So that allows us to identify enforcement priorities on the part of the state that individual employees would never be in a position to identify on their own. So from an enforcement perspective, it's also a useful tool.
And can anyone on the stage contribute to this? But why is it important, do you think, to create fair and equitable working conditions for women and mothers? And I know the first partner talked about why it's important to have women on corporate boards, but going a little bit further, why do you think just in general we need a more equitable workforce?
I'll chime in here. I think that, again, referencing the conversation that she was having, that if we don't have that type of equality, let's just think where all the decisions are being made. They are being made in a boardroom, and if that's void of women, there is definitely different decisions and different outcomes that will happen. And you just dial it back. If we don't have women in the workforce that are achieving those levels or advancing into those levels to even qualify to be, within that top level of leadership, then that's a missing component of what I think is a thought leadership that an organization needs. And so when you look at, the entry level, how many times don't we hear, like, you need to see it to be it? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, if they can't see it, especially, women of color, how do they know that they can be something that's different than their personal experience? So I think those are some of the thoughts.
Yeah.
I'd say on the mothers question, I think it's pretty well known now that mothers face a large wage gap as compared to fathers, who actually get a bonus, a fatherhood bonus. And there's been a lot of crazy studies that we don't have time to go into about that, but based on kind of conceptions about mothers and their abilities. And I think kind of to what you were saying, Kevin, that mothers now more than ever before are either the primary or co-breadwinners in their families. And so ensuring that mothers are treated fairly and equitably in the workplace is not just important for them, but for their families, their potentially male or other spouses, their kids, the economies that they pay into. And so I think ensuring that mothers are treated equitably is critical just across the board. We know that mothers experience a lot of family caregiver discrimination, where employers will make assumptions about them really based on biased assumptions, not based on their actual work performance. For example, and we've literally heard examples of women calling us about this, we're not going to give you the promotion because we know you have young kids at home and it'll be really hard for you to put in those long hours without actually having seen any issue with the person putting in the long hours. And so we know that those kinds of biases exist for family caregivers in general, but specifically mothers, and it's really important that we address those and take proactive steps for companies who have leadership at the top of women to make sure that that type of caregiver discrimination and discrimination against mothers is not being perpetuated.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I think we're leaving untapped potential just sitting on the table when we're not elevating women to these higher positions. And when we're talking about women that are mothers, we have a whole generation, I like to call it the sandwich generation, where you're taking care of your elderly parents, but you also have a young family at home that you're also trying to take care of, and you're going to work every day, and you're trying to balance it all. I am one of those women. I have a 5-year-old son, I have a 7-month-old daughter, and the struggle is real to try to balance it all. But what I do know is that I have protections. Being in a union, you have certain protections, you have certain supports. There's doors that are being open, and that's super important to make sure that all women, working women, are here to stay. We need women in the workforce. We thrive when we're in the workforce. We make the world better when we're in the workforce. And so if we're gonna be in the workforce, if we're gonna stay in the workforce, we need to make sure that we have those protections, not only protections like the family leave, like child care, but we also need to make sure that we're feeling supported. It's just as simple as the first partner said, is having your village, just so that you can make sure that you're feeling supported, because you can feel on an island on your own just being a working mother, and a lot of us have the same struggle, we just seldomly talk about it. So making sure that women are there, that we're in the workforce, that we stay in the workforce is super important, and that we're not being devalued just by the work that we're doing outside of the workforce in being a caregiver.
Can I add one thing
absolutely.
to that? What the first partner talked about, the tone at the top, the leadership of an organization, that is so important to really understand that. Not that you're just looking at a website of values that may be printed on a page, but to really understand that inclusive nature of the highest leaders of an organization. I think you brought that up, that's so important. And I know when she referenced that, I look at that as, what's the tone of an organization? And does that fit with your values or the values that might be on a page?
Which is the perfect segue into my next question. What companies or agencies can you point to that are doing it right, or that we can use as benchmarks? Oh, yeah.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
I did have one example of one of our member companies, and you might all be familiar with an organization called Accenture. And I had an opportunity to visit with them probably about 5 years ago, and I was completely blown away about their goals that they had identified for parity across various spectrums, not just pay, but who's on their board, the entry level, and ensuring that there was parity with the associates that they brought in, the women that were being elevated, the partners in their boardroom. And that was about 5 or 6 years ago, and the goal was to bring about parity by 2025. I know that with regard to pay equity, they met that goal in 2022. And to hear their associates, and I've had the opportunity to learn a little bit about, how they function inside, at least in Los Angeles. And this is not an LA thing, it's a national thing for them. It really gave me a sense of, here's a good example that can be shared to other companies. And I do know that there's several organizations that have similar initiatives. Where I worry is our smaller organizations that don't have the infrastructure to really create those kind of systems in place. But I think that's where organizations like Chambers can come into play and to really help them bridge information gaps that may exist.
And Tiffany, did you have any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I take the question a little bit differently. I don't think I'm going to talk about a corporation. I think I want to talk about innovations and who's kind of doing the innovations. And when you're thinking about innovations, that can go many different ways. I think one of the most transformative innovations come out of when you tell a woman no, or you tell her she can't have it, or you tell her you're not good enough to excel to get to that pay scale, and then to push that narrative to the side and be like, I am worthy, my family is worthy, and I'm gonna go get it. I think that's where true innovation is coming from, and if we're looking at it from that perspective, then it's the California woman. It's the women of color in California that are pushing, we are leading, we are demanding to be heard. We have been breaking down systems of oppression for years. We have been doing it in very innovative ways. In particular, for the labor movement, we've created committees, we've created councils. We have tried to think outside the box. Our fast food workers 2/3 of which are women, 80% of which are people of color, just got $20 an hour minimum wage. Our healthcare workers in the coming years are getting $25 minimum wage. Our child care providers are also innovating, and they're making sure that we have enough slots so that you could stay in the workforce. You also have healthcare, and you have a livable wage. So we have folks that are innovating, and it's not necessarily like big corporations that it's doing it. It's the working women in California, many of which are people of color.
That's great. So my next question is for Jessica. Can you talk about the legislative advances that have been made in California, and then a little bit about the trends you see and how many states and which states are following our lead?
Yeah, so I think the trends in California kind of mirror those buckets of contributors that I mentioned, kind of those contributors to the wage gap. In 2015, we amended our existing state equal pay law to strengthen in a lot of ways. Want to give a shout out to the chamber who was involved and co-sponsored, and that's just really not something you see in a lot of states. And really kind of ensuring that this law has more, really has more of its intended effect to ensure that work is not just measured by whether it's exactly equal, but if you're doing essentially the same or substantially similar work, you have to be paid equally. And that's easier, it's a harder standard to meet at the federal level. So in California, it really recognizes that people doing essentially the same job should get paid the same if you're doing that. It also addressed the issue that I mentioned earlier of pay secrecy. And we know that in a lot of places, in other parts of the country, I hear about this, and it's still shocking to me, that employers will affirmatively say, you cannot talk about pay. It's a rule. You'll be terminated or at least disciplined in some way if you do. And that the California Fair Pay Act explicitly makes that illegal. So workers can talk about pay, ask about pay, discuss pay, and if they cannot be retaliated against for doing that, which we know is so important because that's often how pay disparities come out, is when people are talking about it. Huge kind of improvements in pay transparency, and the pay data collection that Kevin mentioned, I think is a really important pay transparency law, because it really does, as you said, I think a lot of employers might not realize that there are those trends of occupational segregation. And while they might have a perfect pay equity score, which is great, they've done the work to make sure women are being paid equal to their male counterparts doing the same job, they might not be aware of how unequal women are represented at the top, at the higher paying levels. And seeing that pay data really can help them, hopefully incentivize them to make changes to their outreach, recruitment, promotion policies to ensure that women and people of color are represented at all wage levels. And then we've, of course, made a lot of advances in the area of paid family leave and childcare, which we've seen a lot of these trends replicated in other states. A big one that I did not mention, prior salary, going back to what I mentioned earlier. So in California, an employer can't ask about or rely on prior salary unless the candidate wants to provide that information. And that's also something that we've seen replicated in other states. So kind of the beauty of being in California, where we do really have some of the strongest equal pay laws in the country, is that we've seen other states kind of following our lead and then replicating those protections. And one other thing I'll just say is I've also seen that a lot of companies are trying to do the right thing, will, when they have locations across the country, if they're required to, for example, not ask about prior salary in a certain jurisdiction or now a growing number, they just implement a policy across the board. We're not going to ask anywhere. And so that's a way that change in certain areas can actually affect change across the country. But I will just say your rights shouldn't depend on your zip code, and so it is important at the federal level to continue advocating for legislative advances. The Paycheck Fairness Act with regard to pay equity is the big pending legislation. 10 years and going. But it would do a lot of what we've already done in California in terms of strengthening federal equal pay law to ensure it's really carrying out its intent to ensure that women are being paid equally to their male counterparts for doing the same or substantially similar work.
And Kevin, I feel like you have thoughts that you want to share.
No, I mean, maybe this is just a broader thought. When Jessica was talking about the changes to the law, I remember standing in the room and talking to a very prominent law firm partner, a woman, who said, well, these laws can't pass because that's not the way things are done, right? Like, nobody will be able to set salaries if they don't base it on prior salary. And it's never going to work to tell employers that they can't tell employees not to talk about. And I remember, I was trying to be nice in my job at the time. I was like, oh, okay. But I remember thinking like, I think these laws are going to pass. And you're going to be in a position of having to advise people how to comply with them. So like, let's get on board. And that just inspires me to say, the world as it is not the way that the world has to be. Right? Nothing about what we've inherited in our workplaces, in our salary structures, in our systems of justice has to be the way it is, but we have to see the way around it or forward or through it, and then we have to make that change. And once the laws are passed, right, we have to ensure that they're followed. And that requires people to stand up and stand forward, file complaints, talk to their boss, talk to their colleagues, stand in solidarity with each other, and get it done that way.
Yeah, I was going to add one bucket that I failed to mention, which the first partner talked about, is the salary range postings, which I agree with. The law is passed. Employers of certain sizes have to post, 15 or more employees have to post the salary range for a position. And, if people don't know about that right, or if employers aren't complying with that right, we need to ensure that once these types of protections are put into law, that people know about their rights. And I'm so glad to hear there's some high school students here who now know about their rights, to ensure that it's being enforced and that there are luckily some robust enforcement agencies. And again, employers many of whom want to do the right thing. And I know a lot of you work with those employers. And so, for example, the salary range laws, there is a range because you want to be flexible and allow an employer to have some leeway to decide, but also making sure that they have really objective criteria for where someone falls in that range. Because we know that without objective criteria, implicit bias or even sometimes explicit bias can creep in about where that person, a given candidate, will fall in that range. So I think just ensuring that people know about the laws and that employers are complying and that there's enforcement is just a key aspect of the conversation.
Does anyone on the panel have thoughts for people in the room who may work at a smaller company or a smaller agency and they are in a position where they're making hiring decisions or they're the team establishing those pay bands? Do you have any advice for them or best practices?
Go to the First Partners site. What is it called? She just talked to us about it.
The toolkit.
The toolkit.
I think.
The Equal Pay Playbook.
The Equal Pay Playbook. Because I do want to say, nobody comes out of the womb knowing how to set an equal pay structure in a workplace, right? This is learned behavior. And so if you aren't taught it, then you don't know how to do it. So I think we are in a new point in our history in California by having a bunch of tools available to anyone who can access a computer, and I would encourage you to go take a look at it. I actually did last week, and I got tips that I'm going to implement and that I find useful.
And I would add to that, I looked at it too, and I thought it was so great, and it just made me reflect, gosh, I wish I had this way back when. And I think I would even say to the young women in the audience, just to put emphasize what the first partner was saying, do not be afraid to use your voice. I think the 20-something Maria walking into, the workplace for the first time I often say I was a first-gen student and a first professional. I didn't know what I was doing. And I see the toolkits that are available and the information that's available. And I hope that this next generation can use that and really take it in where maybe you might need that extra push and the information is there. Do not be afraid.
All right, I think we're wrapping up. So I want to give you all a chance to leave the room with parting thoughts or what you want us all to continue thinking about to keep moving this movement forward.
Well, you said the word movement, and I was going to say, I believe this is a movement. I've been in the workforce over 30 years, and just to have seen so many changes, and just in recent years, and especially given what the first partner has been doing on gender equity, we need to keep going. We need to have those conversations often, and we need to pull in more, whether it's employers, employees, to broaden the tent of who needs to be having this conversation and being in this room. We're all champions here. let's think of those that are not in this room that need to also carry this message.
I think just kind of touching on what I started with, just keeping in mind that there are a lot of different ways that women are disadvantaged, especially women of color in the workplace, and making sure that we keep the focus on kind of all of those different aspects. We didn't even touch on harassment, which of course is a huge barrier to women's advancement and really is actually an economic security issue because it can lead women to not be promoted or be demoted or even sometimes leave their job due to harassment. And so just having that kind of comprehensive view of what's needed to support women, particularly women of color in the workplace, and support unions, which we know supports them even more than their counterparts, is just critical. And I really appreciate just being in conversation with people who kind of want to try to advance the ball and continue moving the issues forward.
I will say that it's just underscoring that it's about that collective power. It's a collective power that we all should be able to work within the various movements that we are in and the spaces that we share. Being in a union, it just gives us a different perspective. It gives us, it's a union difference. I think I touched on it when I talked about the pay difference and the bump that you get from being in a union. It's a smaller pay gap. That's more effective in particular for Black and Latino women. So just making sure that we are using our voices, we are speaking up in crowds, we are not afraid to come to the forefront, and just making sure that we have that seat at the table. And if you don't, I think I love the saying where it's like, well, take your own chair and you go to the table and you sit there yourself. I love that. And it's important for us all to keep that in mind. But again, just underscoring that collective power that we all have a role and we can do it together if we're ready to achieve great things. I think one of the best things about being in a union and representing 700,000 workers is I think oftentimes people are like, oh, they're the union. They have a lot of political money. They're going to do this and that. And truth of the matter is we stand on the shoulders of our 700,000 workers all across the state of California. That is the public sector workers that are our social workers, those are our librarians, those are the people that are making a difference in our state, and those are the women that should be uplifted, that are proven that with collective power you can achieve a lot of things. So just want to underscore the importance of your voice and sharing it through collective power.
All right, well, thank you all for being here and sharing these insights and strategies with us. I think we're going to have Donna Lucas come up and give closing statements. Yes, another She Shares board member.
I just want to point out when Maria was talking about Accenture, their CEO is a woman. Yes. So that might make sense. Hey, this was a great panel. Thank you all for being here. I think this is one of our largest events we've had, and it was terrific, and we really appreciate all of you and bringing great comments. And stay tuned for the next She Shares.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Donna.